you so much for the introduction. I want to say at the start that today is Mr. Iyer's very first day in Kerala. So I think we should have a rounding applause for that. And not just the first day at KLF, but very first day in Kerala ever. So thank you so much for being here. And I think it's really special to be in conversation with you. I'm going to start with something a little different, and let's go from there. So you have this book called Learning from Silence, and on the very first page, there are these words: fire, burning, radiant, black, sooty, plumes, smoke, incandescent, fire. I want to talk about how fire is sort of a motive that runs through this book. And on the very first page, there's so many references to it, but how fire is also a centering force in your life and in this book.
Thank you. You read the book more carefully than I did, and nobody has noticed all those fire motifs. Just before we begin, I want to thank Kerala for being here, and I want to thank our amazing hosts for putting on the greatest literary show on earth. And I want to thank everyone for loving books so much. As you know, it's not a common thing in other countries to see people so engaged with words and ideas and writers. So it's really an honor to be here. I think in terms of your question, I feel all of us know that the world is on fire. Literally, wildfires all across the planet, but metaphorically, because if you're not worried about fires, you're probably worried about drought or floods or hurricanes or tsunamis. And I think all of us are addressing this essential question: how keep the inner fires of confidence alight when the external fires are devastating everything that we know and love? And as you know, after that first page with all the descriptions of fire, I describe how my own house burnt down. And so the question for me and for many of us is, how do you rebuild a life after fire has literally reduced you to ashes and rubble? I've written a lot about fire through my life, and this book is set on a monastery overlooking the ocean. And I think the interplay of the calm we associate with water and the fury and electricity we associate with fire is probably at the heart of many of our lives and our questions.
The title of this book in the US, if I'm not mistaken, is A Flame, rather different from Learning from Silence. Can we talk about those two different titles?
I almost have to be careful because my publisher was here earlier today, but luckily she's on a plane now. So I can say with impunity, A Flame is the correct title. It's meant to be a poetic book, almost a haiku of a book. And so the title should be suggestive. And the title, Learning from Silence, suggests either that I've learned something or that I'm offering things that others could learn. And I'm not presumptuous enough to suggest that. So it's not a how-to book and it's not an instructive book, but it's more a book about how do we walk through the flames and emerge on the other side intact and maybe stronger than ever. And as you know, because you're such a good reader, that the literal word of flame comes from the desert fathers who went and initiated monasticism in the deserts of the Middle East. And one older monk was asked by a younger monk, I try to lead a good life, I try to observe the golden rule, I try to be compassionate and selfless. What can I do next? And the older monk says, if you so wish, you can be a flame. You can be possessed by fervor and devotion. And so in a book that starts with a monastery encircled by fire and continues with my losing everything in the world in a forest fire, I never wanted to forget that the essential meeting of fire and flames is within. And that's something that every one of us is addressing.
The book is about your time, of course, with the monks and their brothers in this hermitage. And you talk about how doubt is always the centerpiece of faith. In many ways, a festival like this, which is all noise, is it sort of the opposite of silence? And how do these two kind of feed into each other? How do you experience something like this?
I think the world is so noisy now that most of us are crying out for silence. Silence is the only place where we can hear ourselves think. And better than that, it's the only place where we can hear ourselves not think, and something that comes to us that's much deeper than our thoughts and our cerebrations. So this is the world we live in. We need to be surrounded by stimulation and excitement and commotion, but we can't make sense of even a festival like this unless we step away and gather our thoughts and go for a walk and ask, what did I take away from this festival? What really moved me? What surprised me? And so I think movement is almost a prelude to the stillness and silence in which we try to process and make peace with the many things that are coming in on us. And that's harder and harder. There's more and more movement and acceleration in the world and less room to be quiet and to reflect.
I think even when you framed this book, you have sort of 5 movements, right? I think those are the 5 chapters. So maybe since you've mentioned movement and you've spoken about the movement, let's talk about the 5 movements in the book and how a reader might experience those.
Thank you. So 5 movements suggest music, which is very conscious. And it's a book about sitting still. It's a book about going nowhere. But it would be deadening for a reader to pick up a book and just see somebody sitting immobile for the next 250 pages. There's meant to be a steady development. My arriving in a Catholic monastery as somebody who's not Christian and never imagined I'd find myself in a Catholic monastery, being taken in by the beauty of the surroundings, high above the Pacific Ocean in this undeveloped part of Central California, getting to know the monks, finally staying with the monks, traveling deep into their life, which is akin to 40 days and nights in the wilderness, just as you said. They are living every day of their life, not just with faith, but with doubt, with fear, with loneliness, with frustration. They've followed their God into the monastery, but sometimes their God disappears. Sometimes they lose contact with the divine for years on end, and still they have to stay there. And then finally, coming through all that to whatever arises at the end of 40 days and nights in the wilderness. So it's meant to be a book that has enough movement to keep you excited and turning the pages, but also my hope is you could pick it up at any place and read just one page, and it will help you be a little calmer and a little slower, and to take a deep breath so as to step away from the world long enough to make sense of it.
I think you described your experience in the monastery as catching sunlight in a jar, which is a beautiful term, and it also shows the impossibility of it. So what were some of the challenges of conveying that sense of glee and ecstasy that you have for a lay reader who's sitting, in a crowded house in a crowded place?
Yes. Well, that's why I have the 5 movements, because if the poor reader who's a mother with 3 busy kids and a job and all the commotion and distraction of life were to pick up a book and read about somebody just sitting in silence, it would be exasperating for her, not an inspiration, but a source of her own frustration. So I think one of the main things I'm trying to stress in the book is going on retreat is only a way to learn how better to live in the midst of this world and the crowds that are our daily life. And that the surprise for me was that it was only by being in solitude that I could better learn how to be in company, and that I could gather the resources that then I could share with my friends and my family and colleagues. Because I think so often otherwise we're running on empty, and it's only by stepping away from the world that we can, as it were, collect the treasures that then we share with the world. And it's only by stepping away from our life that we can begin to make sense of our life and see its proportions. And as you know, there's a central moment in the book where one of my friends challenges me and she says, "Isn't it selfish to go on retreat?" And I say, well, not if it's the only way you can learn to be a little less unselfish or a little more selfless. But since I'm not a monk, my life takes place right in the middle of these crowds, and going on retreat is only as useful as the candle that it gives me as I navigate the busy streets of our lives.
I think, like you say, solitude kind of gives you the armory to live in daily life.
Yes.
And there's this beautiful line again about how if you hadn't been alone, you might not have ever gotten married.
Yes.
So maybe we can expand on that because I think, again, a lot of people see aloneness as not necessarily a good thing, but how for you it's actually proved to be vital.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. I was actually exactly going to cite that line a minute ago, and I forgot about it. So you are the voice inside my head and my heart. So yeah, I'm an only child. I've chosen to be a writer, which is a very solitary occupation. I love being by myself. My wife was just saying to me in wonder last week, "You're never bored, you're never lonely." And it's true. So when I first went to this hermitage, I have a beautiful room with a private garden overlooking the sea, almost for no money at all. No agenda, every day free to read and write and take walks or do nothing. Ultimate luxury, ultimate heaven. But in time, as I say, I realized it was only a means towards the end of having more to give to the world. And I especially recall one moment, again, you will remember in the book, where I'm on retreat and I drive down to the foot of the hill where there's a public telephone and I collect my messages. I call into my bosses and I call my long term girlfriend, now my wife. And it's a beautiful April spring day. The slopes are flooded with lupins and golden poppies. The blue-green waters of the Pacific are lapping at my feet. And she hears this in my voice. And she says, I never worry about other women. I can always defeat another woman. How can I compete with silence? How can I compete with a temple? And it was such a piercing question. It went right through me. And then and there, I decided to give my life to her. And beyond that, I think if I'd been just leading my normal life, hurrying from the bank to the supermarket to the grocery store, I would never have had the chance to think what really matters. What do I need in life? Where do my responsibilities lie? And what are my highest priorities? And being in the quiet instantly reminded me, what do I love? This woman, I should make her my wife. And it was only being in solitude that allowed me to come to that realization. I was saying in a session just now that I hope nobody here already heard, because this will be like deja vu after 40 minutes, how when I lost everything in the world in a forest fire, that evening I wrote an article for Time magazine about the fire, and I ended with a haiku from the 17th century in which the poet writes, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." And anyone who's had a loss or lived through the pandemic, as everybody here has done, knows that it's those moments when suddenly you remember what you care about, what's important to you, what's essential. And I think it was only by being in solitude that A, the people I love came closer to me than sometimes when they're in the same room. And B, I could answer that essential question, what do I want to do with my life? I want to give it to the people I care about and not just watch the Kardashians or download the next episode of Game of Thrones or whatever I might habitually do in my regular life.
I want to pull on the thread of being a lonely child and your wife a little bit more, because I think, again, in this book, we've spoken about it, but I think it'd be wonderful for the audience to hear it about how your wife meets you in the monastery and she sees you with all the other monks.
Yes.
And she has this moment when she says, "I thought you were only child, but I realized you have 100 brothers." And I think for you, again, that was an important moment because we keep talking about solitude, but you always see solitude in terms of community, in terms of solidarity. So just if we can elaborate on both those.
Thank you. Literally 2 hours ago, I was talking to my editor from Penguin India, and I said, the moment you just cited was the single most important moment in the book. And I love the fact that you bring community into the conversation, because, of course, when I go to stay for 3 days or even 2 weeks, I'm completely by myself. But the monks have given themselves selflessly to community and service for the rest of their lives, 50 years, 60 years. And one thing that humbles me is that these monks are living with 20 other monks. 15 of them may be people they never would want to spend an hour with, and they're going to spend every breathing minute of the rest of their lives tending to everyone. And they have made their devotion and commitment is not really to solitude, but, as you said, to service. And so, as you say, when my wife said, "I always thought you were an only child, I see you have so many brothers," she didn't even know that the word we use for monks is brothers, but it's the perfect word for them. And one of the things that's so moving about living with them and seeing their lives is that many of them have no family except their fellow brothers. And those brothers, one of them, as you know, I describe every night, night after night, he drives 3 hours each way through the mountains to be by the bedside of one of the other monks who's sick. And he is their mother. He is their father as well as their, their prior. He is their brother. And it's a remarkable thing. It's hard enough to give yourself to your wife and kids, and sometimes even harder to give yourself to your parents and siblings, but to devote your life to people with whom you have no connection of that kind, and as I say, may not be temperamentally close to, and yet you are pledged to serve them. So that notion of brotherhood is something that really I came to understand by living with the monks.
I want to build a bit more on the idea of service, because I think, again, in the book, it comes out very well that these are monks who are always doing things. It's not like they're just sitting.
Yes,
they're working, whether it's working on the land, whether it's working on the kitchen, whether it's building,
yes.
And the importance of activity and action. And it's not an idle life at all.
It's a very, very hard life. They're working 24 hours a day. They're never away from the office, as it were. They're never away from the boss or from their responsibilities. And that was one of the great blessings I got when I started to stay actually in the cloister with the monks, because previously I'd just been a tourist in their world, gleaning all the treasures. And when you go there as a visitor, you have a lovely room overlooking the ocean. The monks don't have ocean views. They don't have much space of their own. And as you say, somebody's taking care of accounts, somebody else is in charge of the vegetable garden, somebody else is cooking, and that's unending. They don't really take holidays. In many orders, monks are pledged not even to leave when their mother and father dies. So it's a very, very serious commitment for me. It was hard enough to make the commitment of marriage. They've made a commitment to being married to dozens of other people forever, non-negotiable. And that's an instructive thing, because in the session I just came from, we were talking about what's really useful in the world. And to us, looking at monks or nuns who are just praying or worshipping, you might ask, how are they tangibly helping the rest of us? And I think by their model of service, of compassion, of selflessness, they're actually the most useful people that we might be lucky enough to run into. But all the use is at the level of intangibles and immaterial things. They're not producing anything other than a recipe to how to lead a calmer, clearer life with no sense of separation between you and everything around you.
I think you mentioned at some point about being a tourist. I don't remember the exact line, but it just reminded me how this book comes soon after The Half Known Life, which was about your travels. And in many ways, you have seen this book as the companion of that. And that book is, of course, about movement. And you go to all these various places. It's about, and including Srinagar in India. But can we talk about the companionship between these two books?
Yeah, they're brothers or sisters. And although ostensibly that book is about traveling across 10 countries, as you remember, it's about visions of paradise and cutting through all the illusions of paradise we have. We fly to Bali and we're sitting on a golden beach and all the children around us look like angels and we think this is heaven. And then the darkness falls and you hear the wild dogs barking and you hear the dissonant, unsettling sound of the gamelan. And you realize that these young girls who are dancing are in a trance. And the young men who are dancing are performing a dance that replicates a mass suicide in Balinese history. And you realize that any place with angels is full of devils too. And that paradise is just the notion of a visitor. For the Balinese, this is real life, especially when they're working very hard to make their visitors comfortable. So after cutting through the notion of paradise in many, many different countries, this book about the monks was a sequel, because a cloister is meant to be a vision of paradise, but it's not a paradise in the clouds or away from reality. As we've been saying, it's a paradise in the heart of reality that lives in the midst of hard work and impermanence and disease and death, almost in a Buddhist way. And I think, again, monks and nuns are very instructive in telling us not to look for a paradise outside ourselves, but the only paradise you can trust is one in the heart of the real world that takes in all the afflictions that come to every human being, including sickness, old age, and death.
One of the famous monks in the book, and you don't mention him immediately, is Leonard Cohen. Many of you might know him as the singer-songwriter. I want to ask you about the decision to not name him immediately and to kind of pause. And you talk about him, you mentioned these incidents with him, but you reveal his name. It's a reveal after a few pages. So just talk us through that.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. You really understand the writer's decision and the sort of hours and weeks of craft that go into deciding to name him in the 15th paragraph instead of the first. So I was very moved in 1995 on a very cold winter day. I drove up into the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles, and I pulled into a parking lot, and a very stooped figure in a tattered black robes with a very unflattering cap and wire-rimmed glasses came out, and he bowed to me, though we'd never met before, and then he insisted on taking my cases into a little cabin where I'd be staying. And as soon as we got there, he started cooking dinner for me. And I was so moved by this person who was only thinking about my comfort that for 20 minutes I didn't realize it was my lifelong hero, Leonard Cohen, who had completely disappeared into the role of an anonymous monk. And many of you may know for 5.5 years, he lived as a Zen monk in the mountains behind Los Angeles with a monastic named Jikam, which means the silence between two thoughts. And for those 5.5 years, all he did was shovel snow, cook for the aged Japanese head of the community, and scrub floors. And it was so touching to me in my 30s to meet a man who was 61 years old. He'd been famous for 25 years. He was a worldwide celebrity and heartthrob. He could have been doing anything in the world with anyone in the world. And he was putting himself through this backbreaking discipline. And with characteristic eloquence, he said, "This is the real voluptuous adventure. This is the delicious excitement. After 61 years of enjoying and savoring all the pleasures of the world, he had found this to be the great stimulation." And that really shook me up, that working incredibly hard as a monk and meditating 18 hours a day as he was during the week when I was visiting might be more exciting than everything that Leonard Cohen had experienced hitherto.
Have you ever asked yourself if you can completely give into that life? Could you become like a Leonard Cohen and live there for 5 years and leave everything else? Is that something you deal with or never?
I failed completely. When I was 29, I was leading a very exciting life in New York City, and I left it with the hope of being a monk in Japan, and I bailed out very quickly. It was much too much hard work. I didn't have the discipline or the selflessness to give myself to that life. And although I've always felt a real pang every time I go to a monastery, the way some people feel a pang when they see a strawberry shortcake or a beautiful person, I feel that sense of longing every time I step into one, but I clearly don't have what it takes. And that probably also was one reason I was so humbled and moved to see this man who had to give up so much had done so. And as you probably know, the sequel to that story is that Leonard Cohen was honest enough after 5.5 years as a monk to see that it hadn't answered all his problems and it didn't resolve his doubts. And then, remarkably, he came to Bombay and lived in this tiny little guest house, Kemp's Corner, and every day went to hear a retired bank manager talk about how to break through the dualities of life. And this was interesting to me because when I first met Leonard Cohen in 95, we would talk through the day and the night when he wasn't meditating. And I asked him, "Have you ever been to India?" And he said, "Forgive me, I'm somebody who's addicted to order. And I worry that India might be too disorderly, too chaotic. I don't think it's the place for me." And then the next thing I knew, India had become his new spiritual home. And he felt that India rounded out and complemented what he had learned in Zen training. So that took a lot of courage and honesty too. First, to go into a monastery at the age of 61, and then to walk out of it and say, first, I can supplement this learning by going to a different tradition. And then famously, as you know, and probably most people here know, when he came down from the monastery, he found that somebody had made off with all his money and he was bankrupt. At the age of 73, had to go on the road again for 6 years, performing 380 concerts around the world in order to make money for his children and his grandchildren when he died. And I remember when we were talking about how he'd been made bankrupt, I said to him, well, maybe through some karmic justice, this is what your years in the monastery were preparing you for. And he smiled and probably acknowledged there was a certain logic to it.
You mentioned, I think at the start, how this book should read a bit like a haiku. And you've often said how living in Japan, you've lived there for 3 decades, has changed your writing. They say you shouldn't ask speculative questions, but I am going to ask you one. What would your writing have been like if you had continued to live in India?
It'd be like the streets right round, jam-packed. Auto rickshaws, cars, pedestrians, bicycles, motorbikes. My first book, Video Night in Kathmandu, was like the streets of Mumbai, jam-packed with things, very maximalist, crammed with details. And you're so wise to perceive that the longer I've lived in Japan, the more I take the details out so that the silence can speak. In this case, I had maybe 3,000 pages of notes taken over 34 years, more than 100 retreats. So I'd spent a good part of my life in this monastery. And then the challenge became, how do I reduce it to something very, very short and readable that people in their busy lives might be tempted to pick up? And so it was mostly a matter of taking things out. And I think when I was a kid, I thought creativity is all about generating as many ideas, impressions, words as possible. And the older I get, I see how much creativity is about taking everything out so there's just one image on a page. So if, when I wrote Video Night in Kathmandu, if I were describing my first day in Kerala, I would have put in every encounter that I've had this entire day and the drive through the streets and the people I've met and the foliage and the river in the distance. If I were to write about Kerala now, after 38 years in Japan, I might just have one song from a bird. That is what I'm taking away from Kerala. In the same way that this table has, let's say, 6 objects on it, it's quite hard to concentrate on any one of them. But if we took this tray away and there were only 2 glasses left, there's much more room for a reader to enter. And I think what I'm describing is the journey from monologue to conversation. Because if I'm, in my first book, I was lecturing the reader with all my observations and prejudices. Now I'm trying to be almost out, so I give the reader just one word, and she completes the sentence, and she half writes the book. And she, when I present her with just 2 glasses of water, she takes that in her imagination, she makes something magical out of it, much more magical than anything I could make. So all I'm doing is really offering a prompt for the reader to embroider upon. And I think that seems like a kinder approach than pontificating to her.
Thank you. It's interesting how you always imagine your reader as a she.
It's a fact of life. I think in the United States, the working assumption is 80% of readers are women. Most of the people running book festivals and bookshops are women. Men have defected. They read history and political biographies a little. But fiction and poetry, which I think is the heart of writing, is very much in the hands of women. And I think many of the writers I most cherish are women. I would be surprised if there was a man sitting in this chair asking questions. And if there were, his questions wouldn't be as subtle as and intuitive as yours.
The other sort of central motive of this book is time and your relationship to time. And you've often said about how you're free with money, but you're very possessive with time. And I think, there's the instance of Kairos and the god with the single lock, and you try to grab him and you can't because he has no hair at the back. But that's the good moments and the fortunate moments. And if you don't get a grip on that tiny lock, then the good moments have gone. So can we just talk about your own relationship with time and why that's sort of an anchoring force again to your books?
Well, this is a very embarrassing moment, Nandini, because I hadn't realized I'd written that so often, because it's in my next book too, and I'm going to have to go back to Japan and take it out, because I hadn't realized I'd already held forth on that subject. But you're right, I think part of the great liberation of being in the monastery is the first thing I do is take off my watch. It's actually the first thing I do when I return to my 2-room flat in the middle of nowhere in Japan, because time becomes immaterial. I don't have plans. I don't have obligations. I don't have to be ruled by the ticking clock that subtly brings us into a state of agitation and acceleration. I can relax into something much more spacious. And I think you mentioned kairos just now, and many people here will know that the Greeks had 2 words for time: chronos, which is clock time, which is the calendar we fill with our obligations, and kairos, which is sacred time, time out of time, where you feel that you're in contact with eternity, when you're in love, when you're on your knees in a church or temple, when you're deeply moved by a concert or a work of art. You're taken out of yourself and you're taken out of time. And as my wife would say, time stops and you're in a much more special place. So one of the delights of going to the monastery is stepping out of time. And I've tried to make that part of my daily life back in Japan. But of course, the importance of being in the monastery is to go back into the world of time, but not feel intimidated or terrified or hurried by it. I suppose the book comes out of my sense that many of us are in such a hurry now, we can't see what a hurry we're in, and we have to do something very radical to break through that vicious cycle and suddenly realize we're moving faster than we want to be or than we ought to be. And I think humans were never designed to live at a pace determined by machines. And in the course of my life, as I've seen first the fax machine and then the internet and then social media and the smartphone come in, I've seen the world moving faster and faster and faster. AI is going to take it even faster. And there's no way humans can keep up with that. And the more we try to keep up with that, the more we're going to lose our humanity. And all of us know that the more you try to keep up with the moment now, the further you fall behind, and certainly the dizzier you become. So the remedy to that seems to be to step away from the tyranny of time, and the tyranny of needing to keep up with what happened 6 minutes ago or 6 days ago to see what's going to happen 6 years from now. And as you know, one of the other monks that I only belatedly name in this book, but who's been a big part of my life for 51 years, is the Dalai Lama. And I think he's a perfect example of somebody deeply in the world who nonetheless, were he on the stage, would bring such a sense of calm, clarity, and groundedness that every sense of haste and rush and pressure would fall away from the people in the audience. And he's an example of somebody bringing a wisdom that's out of time into the world of time. And Leonard Cohen probably too.
When was the last time you experienced kairos, time out of time?
Well, I'm reliving it now because I'm writing a book on it, actually, a book on transcendence. When was the last time? I went into a museum in Kanazawa, Japan last year, consecrated to D.T. Suzuki, a great Buddhist scholar. And when you go to a museum in honor of a famous writer or thinker, you know it's going to be filled with his papers, his photographs, letters, memorabilia. I think almost every time I've been to a writer's house, that's what I find. So I stepped into D.T. Suzuki's house, basically nothing there. There was a chair looking out on the window. There was onto a garden. There was an empty pond. There was one sentence from him in every room, and most of the rooms were empty. And I realized they've done something magical. They're not reproducing the letter of this famous scholar. They're reproducing his spirit. And what they've done is to create this deeply contemplative, uncluttered environment so we can not learn about D.T. Suzuki, but in some ways experience what he was trying to impart in his writing. And I thought it was completely unexpected and a transcendent experience. And whoever you are, you know, I'm not a Buddhist, but whoever you are, if you step into that space, you are going to live everything that he wrote in his 500-page books. And so that was a real kairos.
One of the other things that you talk very movingly in this book is about the different kinds of silences. The silence of a forest is different from the silence of a mountaintop, and it's different from the silence of a monastery. Maybe we can just sort of expand on that and the different kinds of experiences you've had through these different silences.
Yes, I think the main thing I will say, there's every silence I've experienced in any monastery or convent from Australia to New Mexico to England to Japan to California, and no doubt it would be the same in India, is exactly the same silence. And it's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of something. It's an active, alive, quickening presence. So, in that sense, it's very different from just being on a mountaintop or in a silent forest. It's something that's been created through decades of prayer and meditation that becomes like a series of transparent glass walls that you can almost touch. And the silence, that kind of silence, really dramatically frees you from yourself and wakes you up to everything that's around you, which we get when we're walking through a beautiful park or climbing a mountain. But here it's something distinctly different. And of course, it's hard to describe, but anyone who's experienced it will know the qualitative difference.
Make a conscious choice in the book to not make it too remote, right? I think you want
To
too remote. You want the
Yeah.
reader to be able to access it. And so you have quotes from Emily Dickinson, you have Bono, and of course you have Thoreau and Walden. So we talk about just the inclusion of, sort of popular writers in a way who pepper your book and how their anecdotes add a lot of sparkle to the work.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think many of us, myself included, make a very artificial distinction between those people in a spiritual world and those of us in the daily world, and assume that they are privy to a certain kind of truth that is hidden from us. And so you're exactly right. I really took pains in this book again and again to quote just regular writers that everybody reads: Emily Dickinson, Camus, Thoreau, Henry Miller, who seems a very secular writer, because each one of them, in his or her best moments, is speaking for those moments out of time and speaking for some universal truth that often we lose sight of. So it's not the particular preserve only of Thomas Merton or Leonard Cohen or the Dalai Lama or the many beautiful nuns who share their wisdom. It's the world beyond divisions. And again, any Buddhist reading the works of Christian monks would instantly recognize that's my home. And so too, with a Christian reading the works of the Dalai Lama, would instantly recognize the truth in that. So the world is so divided now. In this book, I was trying to think, how can we reach that space where our divisions fall away and we're reminded of how much unites us? And I think one reason that I wrote the book after 34 years of spending time there was that the world is more distracted than ever, it's more despairing than ever, and it's more divided than ever. And I think the beauty of silence is that it's beyond discussion, literally, in every sense. And so my feeling is that if all of us in this room were to start talking about, if I were to talk individually to each one of you about religion or politics, we'd find ourselves at odds after an hour or two. But if all of us here were joined in a moment of silence, I think we'd be united in some place much deeper than our ideas and our ideologies, where we're all returned to some humanity that we share. It's the same thing that happens if you walk down the street and you see somebody fall to the ground. You reflexively reach out a hand. You're not asking, is she Hindu or Muslim? Did she vote for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump? Does she agree with me or not? You're responding to a humanity you share. And I think that's part of what silence brings us back to, because it's our words and our beliefs that tend to divide us more violently than ever right now. And the more we're captive to our words and beliefs, for example, through the digital world, where all you're getting are beliefs, opinions, and prejudices, the more we're cut up, and the more we're cutting up everyone around us. And silence speaks for a much wider reality, where perhaps there's a chance of stepping beyond the divisions that our minds make by using categories. You're from Kerala, and so is from Gujarat. Well, that's true, but the amount that you share is probably 96%, and the amount that separates you is relatively small. But I think there's a greater emphasis, especially in the age of social media, to concentrate on opinions and therefore on the things that separate us rather than the things we share. And so that seemed an important time to bring silence back into the conversation, as it were.
You mentioned Dalai Lama briefly, and of course, you've written about him, you've spent considerable time with him. What are some of your reflections about him when it comes to silence? Because he is such a public figure. He's meeting people all the time. He's very much in the public limelight. So can we talk about him and silence?
So, 10 times recently, 10 Novembers, the Dalai Lama came to Japan. And I was next to him as close as I am to you for every minute of his working day. 8 hours a day, day after day, year after year after year. Indeed, as you say, traveling across the country, meeting politicians. I sat in on all his private audiences with heavy metal musicians and other spiritual leaders and business executives. Had lunch with him every day. We went shopping together for a new pair of glasses for him. We'd stop off in convenience stores to share cans of hot tea. And just watching him go through his day, I was exhausted at the end of every day. I'm 22 years younger than he. I wasn't doing anything. He was interacting with each person, and I was tired. And then finally, I realized one day, every morning, as I was enjoying my beauty sleep and then waking up and helping myself to second helpings at the buffet breakfast, he was waking up every morning, even on the road, 3:30 a.m., and devoting his first 4 hours to meditation. And later in the afternoon, once his official day was concluded at 4:30, retiring to his room for more meditation. So the only way he could give himself so fully with absolute attention and presence to every last child that he met in the course of his 8-hour day was by gathering his resources and his energies for 4 hours at the beginning of every day. And it made me think, if the busiest person I know can devote 4 hours every morning and then more hours later in the day to meditation, somebody like me could probably do 20 minutes. I mean, that's not asking too much. And although I don't do that as much as I should, it really was a useful instruction that the only way to navigate the busy world is to gather yourself. There's a famous story. Mahatma Gandhi used to, I think, meditate an hour a day. And at one point, he looked at his schedule and he had a very, very busy day. And he said, I'm not going to be able to meditate for an hour a day. This is a really busy day. And all his friends and disciples were really shocked. He said, no, this is a super busy day. I'll have to meditate 2 hours a day. And it's really the same thing that the Dalai Lama is teaching. The busier we are, the more we have to take conscious means to separate ourselves from that busyness, or we just lose ourselves in the whirlwind. Because through all of history, in every continent and culture and century, people have noticed that those who are busy are seldom very wise. And those who are wise, like the Dalai Lama, never seem very busy. They've made their peace with time. They're never hurried. They're sort of, as you were saying earlier, and I was saying, they're bringing Kairos into the world of Chronos.
It's interesting how you've written a book called The Man in My Head, which is about Graham Greene and your father. But when you talk about contemplation and when you talk about meditation, it's always about getting out of your head, right? It's not about coming in. So, can we talk a little bit about this, about being in one's head, since you've written a book about it, and being sort of out of it?
What a good question. You're probably the only person in the world who's read all my books and knows them so well you can stitch them together. It's a great compliment gift for me. Thank you. That book came out of the sense that I sometimes feel closer to the writer Graham Greene, whom I never met, than I do to my friends and family. And all of us have this. We feel this real connection to, Bob Dylan or Timothy Chalamet or whoever it might be, but we feel as if we know some person we've never met, and that somehow they're as close to us as our own skin. And so I wanted to investigate why I would choose as a kind of adopted shadow father this Englishman who was not very exemplary in his attitudes, but who somehow, when he writes, I feel he's writing my diary, and that he's been observing all my secrets, and his secrets are mine in some ways. So it was a way to spend a lot of time with this writer that I've always loved, but also to pose the question of how we have affinities that are much deeper than our affiliations. The first day when I stepped into Japan on a 20-hour layover flying from Hong Kong to New York, I just walked around the airport town of Narita, and I thought, I know this place. I recognize it. I know this place better than I know the town where I grew up, the street where I live, anything in my life. And there's no way of explaining that. My mother said you must have been Japanese in a past life. Maybe that's some explanation. But all of us have this sensation, maybe in a crowded room like this, meeting a stranger and feeling you know that stranger better than the people who are so much a part of your lives. And I don't know what's going on in it, but I thought it would be interesting to investigate that. And so it is called The Man Within My Head, because one of his early books is called The Man Within. But he's probably more in my soul or my being or something deeper than my head, because he's speaking to me in some emotional or spiritual way, really, rather than in an intellectual way. And yeah, I was fascinated by, as a writer, how do I get into your head? You know, how do I form such an intimacy with a reader that that reader feels that he or she knows me?
You've spoken a little bit about distraction, and you famously are one of the authors who does not own a cell phone at all. So maybe we can talk to the audience about that, because I think most people do find that fascinating. Because I mean, we all lived cell phone free till 20 years ago, but now it's become such a necessity.
So 20 years ago, I was 48. So that means 48 of my 68 years, I'm used to functioning in the world without a cell phone. And if somebody says, I'll meet you at 6 o'clock, I'll try to be there at 6 o'clock. And if he or she is late, it's no problem because it's my fault for not having a cell phone. So it's not something that I recommend to anybody, but I'm willing to make the trade off of giving up certain convenience and comfort that comes with having a smartphone in order to be free of distractions. So as I'm talking to you, my hope is I'm giving myself entirely to you. I'm not feeling anything vibrating in my, I'm not thinking as soon as we're finished, I'm going to have to check the 16 texts that arrive. I'm not, in a speeded up life that comes even when I check my emails and a laptop. I'm hoping that, I can give, for example, when I'm with my wife, I want to give her my full attention. I don't want to be looking here with the person I've given my life to. So it does become increasingly difficult. In the hotel where I'm staying here, you need a QR code to get the room service menu, so I don't know what's available in room service. When it comes to dual authentications, I often can't access a website. So that's the price I pay, but I'm willing to pay that price so as not to be hostage to 600 notifications, upgrades, and news flashes every day and every minute. And I think what goes with the cell phone, I was talking to some new friend as I was walking over to this tent for this event, was that I've been part of the mainstream media for 43 years, writing for Time Magazine and New York Times and the Financial Times and their Indian equivalents. And one result of that is I don't trust at all the media. And I think more and more the media is only in the job of trying to inflame our sense of anxiety, rage, or excitement, and actually clouding us from the larger picture. So I'm very happy to be in a media-free environment, which not having a cell phone helps me with. I remember during the pandemic, every morning when I woke up, I thought, shall I look at what cuts me up, or shall I look what opens me up? If I were to turn on the smartphone and find the news, during the pandemic, I would read maybe 1,000 people had just died of COVID in Bolivia, and the morgues in Iran were overflowing. Really, really tragic, heartbreaking material. But I genuinely felt there was nothing I could do to help those people. And by following the news, I was failing to help the people immediately around me, my family, my friends, and my neighbors whose lives I could affect. And then I would look out the window on what was often a radiant spring morning and be flooded with hope and possibility. And so I thought, even following the news is taking me away from everything essential that's going to make me a good citizen, friend, son, husband, and father, and turning me into a kind of whirligig. And conversely, looking in the other direction is going to fill me with a sense of confidence and wonder and beauty, and therefore make me, I hope, better friend to the people I met in the course of the day. So apart from not having a cell phone, I live in a more or less media-free environment, which is a strange thing for a journalist. And people, especially in India, people are often surprised that somebody who's a working journalist and travels a lot can function without a cell phone. But I feel I don't know how people function with a cell phone.
Thank you. I think there'll be lots of questions. So do raise your hand and we'll pass you a mic.
Hello, sir.
Hello?
First of all, thank you for your talk and thank you for being here. So, I would just like to ask, since you emphasized so much upon silence and you ended your talk with like saying that you live in a more or less media free environment, but like, can there not be a middle ground that can be found in which, because it's very important that you be aware of what is happening in your surroundings? We can say, like, we can simply not like we oftentimes a lot of people don't have the privilege to like just separating themselves from what is happening in their reality daily. So like, can there be no middle ground for ordinary human being to like live in the society, live in the realities of society, and still navigate that space by holding on to their own like self-respect, self-worth, and not losing themselves while still living in that reality? Because like, I don't think that a lot of us would have that privilege to be media free. Like, I mean,
Well, I think the whole conversation has really been about being in the middle ground, because as you say, all of us here, ordinary people, we're all having to live in the world, and we're all having, as you said perfectly, to preserve our self-respect, which is sometimes what we lose sight of if we get too distracted. Our self-respect probably comes from our kindness and service and responsibilities to the people around us, and not from knowing what Donald Trump just said, or who's running for president in France, or whatever it might be. So we have to be aware of the world, but I think that begins by being aware of the immediate environment around us. And my fear is that if I see things just through screens that are very distant from me, they're taking me away from you and Nandini and my wife, who might be right here. But I absolutely agree. The middle ground is the only one. So I'm not saying we should all be living up in the clouds like monks. I fail to do that, and I do it just 3 days every 3 months. So, but just if I didn't do those 3 days, I worry that I would lose all connection with something real. But thank you for your question.
Hello, sir. My question is really simple. Whenever I look within, I've never found any silence or stillness or anything like that. The more I try to be silent, the more noise there is within. So my question is, isn't this idea of silence and stillness just a philosophical concept, just good for writing books and philosophizing instead of being an actual reality fact of life?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry if I sound a bit rude. And
I think nothing comes instantly and there are no shortcuts in life. But my sense is if you could work really hard to be silent for, let's say, 1 minute a day, after a few months, it might become 2 minutes, and it might become 5 minutes, and might become 10 minutes. And probably doesn't need to become more than 20 minutes in a day. But I think it's like an investment. It's like saving money for your inner savings account, which is the only thing you have to draw upon when suddenly life becomes very difficult. My question for myself always is, what do I do when somebody is in hospital and maybe very close to death? What do I have to bring to that situation? So my CV is no use. The books I've written are beside the point. My bank account isn't much help. The only thing I can bring to that situation and that person, whatever resources I have within, and I feel the only way I can begin to gather those resources is by just trying to be quiet. And I think one doesn't need, just as the previous question was suggesting, one doesn't need to set very high standards. None of us is going to be the Dalai Lama. None of us is going to be Leonard Cohen. But indulge yourself with, take a walk for 5 minutes a day, and the whole day might work out better, is my feeling. And obviously, it's not entire silence. The cars are still honking, people are still shouting. But you can just clear your head a little and see the fruits of that, maybe.
Hello, Pico. I find travel to be often my biggest test of stillness. And whenever I come back home after travel, there is this deep sense of relief. So, as someone for whom travel is the way, what do you feel when you come back home after travel?
Every time I come back from a trip, after 3 days or 2 days, I ask myself 3 questions. What most surprised me? What most moved me? And what might cause me to live a little differently? And then 2 months after I've come back from a trip, I ask myself the same 3 questions. What surprised me? What moved me? And what did I learn that might cause me to live differently? And the answers are often very different. So travel itself is a very agitating, tense, pressure-filled event more and more. And so there is a sense of relief when you come home, and there are 1,000 things you don't have to think about. But if you've made a journey that's going to be part of your life, I think I also find myself thinking, what true souvenir have I gathered on this journey, even if it's been a difficult one, that can make me see the world differently. Much of my travel has been to war zones and the most impoverished places in the world. So I try to go to Yemen and Haiti and North Korea and other places of great difficulty, both to keep it real for myself and also to shake myself up and send myself home with new thoughts about how to live a balanced life.
We have time for just one more. Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Leonard Cohen going back on the road at the age of 73. As a writer yourself, from a literary viewpoint, which Cohen song do you most associate with inner silence?
Oh, which Cohen song? My favorite song of his, and his favorite song of his, I believe, was If It Be Your Will. Beautiful prayer from 1984 on the same record as his song Hallelujah, which is perhaps better known. If It Be Your Will begins with 35 words, 33 of them are monosyllables. So the language is absolutely transparent. It's simple, so you can see right through the words to what lies behind them. And when you listen to If It Be Your Will, as with many of his songs, you don't know if it's a man singing to his lover, a student singing to his teacher, or somebody singing to his God. And all of them apply. And God and Goddess become one. And at some level, it doesn't matter whom he's addressing. What's really important is the spirit of devotion and surrender. One of the most moving things when I spent time with Leonard Cohen was he was the most articulate writer I've ever met, spellbinding with words. And yet, when he was a monk, he had chosen to give up his words, to give up his self, and to live in silence. So when The Edge, the guitarist of U2, was invited to the Sistine Chapel to sing a song, the song he sang correctly was If It Be Your Will.
Thank you so much. On that note, we have to end. Again, a big applause to Mr. Iyer because his first day in Kerala, which I think deserves a great round. Thank you so much. And thank you, KLF.
And thank you, Nandini, for knowing my work so intimately and beautifully. I really appreciate it.